What if the parts of yourself you hate the most are the key to becoming your best self? What if the anger, jealousy, or insecurity you've been trying to hide could actually set you free? Today we're diving into one of the most profound ideas in psychology, Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self. And by the end of this video, you might just see your dark side in a whole new light. Carl Jung was one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. He believed that the human psyche is made up of many layers, some visible and some hidden. One of these hidden layers is what he called the shadow self. The shadow is the part of us that we reject, suppress, or ignore. It's made up of the traits, emotions, and desires we're taught to hide, whether by society, our families, or even ourselves. But here's the thing, the shadow doesn't go away just because we ignore it. In fact, the more we try to bury it, the more it controls us from the shadows. So, why does the shadow matter? Because understanding it isn't just about psychology, it's about living a fuller, more authentic life. When we ignore our shadow, we project our insecurities onto others, sabotage our relationships, and stay stuck in cycles of self-doubt. But when we face it, something incredible happens. We start to heal, grow, and become more whole. In this video, we'll explore what the shadow self really is, why it's so powerful, and how you can begin to embrace it. By the end, you'll have the tools to start your own journey of self-discovery, and you might just find that your dark side isn't so dark after all. So, what exactly is the shadow self? According to Carl Jung, the shadow is the part of our psyche that we don't want to acknowledge. It's made up of the traits, emotions, and desires we've been taught to hide, whether because they're seen as negative, unacceptable, or even dangerous. Think of it like this. If your personality is a bright, shining light, the shadow is the dark space behind it. It's the part of you that you don't show to the world, or even to yourself. But here's the catch. The shadow isn't just the bad parts of you, it's also the parts that society has told you to suppress, like your creativity, your anger, or even your ambition. The shadow is everything you've been taught to reject about yourself. But why does the shadow exist in the first place? The answer lies in how we're raised and the world we live in. From a young age, we're taught what's good and what's bad. We're rewarded for being kind, polite, and obedient, and punished for being angry, selfish, or rebellious. Over time, we learn to hide the parts of ourselves that don't fit this mold. We push them down, lock them away, and pretend they don't exist. But here's the thing. The shadow doesn't disappear. It just goes underground, influencing our thoughts, feelings, and actions in ways we don't even realize. So, what does the shadow look like in real life? Let's take a few examples. Imagine someone who's always polite and accommodating, but deep down, they're seething with anger they never express. That anger is part of their shadow. Or think about someone who's constantly achieving and succeeding, but inside, they feel like a fraud, terrified that others will find out they're not as capable as they seem. That fear is part of their shadow. Even something as simple as jealousy, like feeling envious of a friend's success, can be a sign of the shadow. These are all parts of ourselves we've been taught to hide, but they don't go away. They just show up in other ways, like passive-aggressive behavior, self-sabotage, or even physical illness. Now, you might be wondering, why does the shadow even matter? Here's the truth. Ignoring your shadow doesn't make it go away. In fact, the more you try to suppress it, the more it controls you. Think of it like a beach ball you're trying to hold underwater. You can push it down for a while, but eventually it's going to pop back up, and when it does, it can hit you hard. That's what happens when we ignore our shadow. It shows up in our relationships, our work, and even our health. But when we face it, when we bring it into the light, something incredible happens. We start to understand ourselves better. We stop projecting our insecurities onto others, and we begin to live more authentically. The shadow isn't something to be afraid of. It's something to explore, understand, and ultimately embrace. One of the most dangerous consequences of ignoring your shadow is something called projection. Projection happens when we see traits we dislike in ourselves, but instead of acknowledging them, we attribute them to someone else. For example, imagine someone who's constantly criticizing others for being selfish. Deep down, they might be struggling with their own selfish tendencies, but it's easier to point the finger at someone else than to face the truth about themselves. This is how the shadow works. It hides in the dark, but it doesn't stay there. It leaks out, often in the form of judgment, blame, or even hatred toward others. And the worst part? We don't even realize we're doing it. We think we're seeing the world clearly, but in reality, we're just seeing a reflection of our own shadow. Another danger of ignoring your shadow is self-sabotage. When we reject parts of ourselves, those parts don't just disappear, they find other ways to express themselves. Think about someone who's constantly procrastinating, even though they know they have an important deadline. On the surface, it might look like laziness or poor time management, but deep down, it could be their shadow at work, a fear of failure, or even a fear of success. The shadow doesn't want to be ignored, it wants to be seen. And if we don't face it, it will sabotage our relationships, our careers, and even our dreams. It's like having an invisible enemy inside us, one that knows exactly how to push our buttons and bring us down. Ignoring your shadow doesn't just affect your behavior, it also takes a toll on your emotions. When we suppress parts of ourselves, we're essentially locking away our feelings. Anger, sadness, fear. These emotions don't just vanish. They build up inside us like pressure in a volcano, and eventually they erupt. This is why so many people struggle with anxiety, depression, or even physical illness. Their shadow is trying to get their attention, but instead of listening, they push it down even further. The result? A life that feels heavy, exhausting, and disconnected. The truth is, emotions aren't meant to be suppressed. They're meant to be felt, understood, and released. But when we ignore our shadow, we lose touch with this essential part of ourselves. Let's look at a real-life example. Imagine a successful business person who seems to have it all: money, power, respect. But behind the scenes, they're struggling with crippling self-doubt. They've spent years pushing themselves to achieve more, but no matter how much they accomplish, it's never enough. Why? Because they're ignoring their shadow, the part of them that feels unworthy, no matter how successful they become. Or think about someone who's always the nice guy or nice girl. They never get angry, never say no, and never stand up for themselves. But deep down, they're filled with resentment, and it's slowly poisoning their relationships. These are just two examples, but they show how dangerous it can be to ignore your shadow. It doesn't matter how successful, kind, or put together you seem on the outside. If you're not facing your shadow, it will find a way to disrupt your life. The first step to identifying your shadow is self-reflection. This means taking an honest look at yourself, your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and asking, what am I hiding? One of the best ways to do this is through journaling. Here's a simple exercise to get started. Take a piece of paper and write down the traits you dislike in others. Maybe it's selfishness, arrogance, or laziness. Now ask yourself, do I ever act this way even in small ways? This is often a clue to your shadow. Another exercise is to think about your emotional triggers. What situations or people make you feel angry, jealous, or insecure? These strong emotions are often a sign that your shadow is being activated. The key is to approach this with curiosity, not judgment. The goal isn't to beat yourself up, it's to uncover the hidden parts of yourself so you can begin to heal. While everyone's shadow is unique, there are some common traits that many of us share. For example, greed, the desire to always want more, even at the expense of others, or envy, feeling resentful when someone else succeeds. Fear of failure is another common shadow trait, the belief that you're not good enough, no matter how much you achieve. These traits often manifest in subtle ways. Maybe you find yourself constantly comparing yourself to others, or you feel a pang of jealousy when a friend gets a promotion. These emotions aren't bad. They're just signs that your shadow is trying to get your attention. The more you can recognize these traits in yourself, the easier it becomes to understand and integrate your shadow. Sometimes the best way to identify your shadow is to ask for feedback from others. The people around us, our friends, family, or coworkers, often see things in us that we can't see ourselves. For example, maybe someone has told you that you can be controlling, even though you don't see it. Or perhaps you've been told that you're overly critical, even though you think you're just being honest. This kind of feedback can be uncomfortable, but it's incredibly valuable. It's like holding up a mirror to your shadow. So the next time someone gives you constructive criticism, try not to get defensive. Instead, ask yourself, is this a part of my shadow that I've been ignoring? Finally, there are some clear warning signs that your shadow is influencing you. One of the biggest signs is recurring conflicts. Do you find yourself having the same arguments over and over again, whether it's with your partner, your boss, or your friends? This could be a sign that your shadow is projecting onto others. Another warning sign is emotional outbursts. Do you ever feel like your emotions are out of control, like you're suddenly angry, sad, or anxious for no reason? This could be your shadow trying to break through. Even physical symptoms like chronic stress or fatigue can be a sign that your shadow is weighing you down. The key is to pay attention to these signs, not as something to fear, but as clues to help you understand yourself better. So, why is integrating your shadow so important? Because when we ignore or reject parts of ourselves, we create inner conflict. We become fragmented, like a puzzle with missing pieces. But when we embrace our shadow, we start to feel whole. Integration doesn't mean becoming your shadow. It means acknowledging it, understanding it, and finding a way to channel its energy in a positive way. This is how we move from self-rejection to self-acceptance, and ultimately to self-mastery. The first step is to acknowledge your shadow. This means recognizing the traits, emotions, and desires you've been hiding, even from yourself. Think about the exercises we discussed earlier, the traits you dislike in others, your emotional triggers, and the feedback you've received. These are all clues to your shadow. The key here is honesty. You don't have to like these parts of yourself, just admit that they exist. Say to yourself, this is part of me, and that's okay. The next step is to understand your shadow. Ask yourself, why do I feel this way? Where does this come from? Often, our shadow traits are rooted in past experiences like childhood conditioning, societal expectations, or traumatic events. For example, if you struggle with fear of failure, maybe it's because you were constantly criticized as a child. Understanding the why behind your shadow helps you see it as a part of your story, not something to be ashamed of. Once you've acknowledged and understood your shadow, the next step is acceptance. This doesn't mean you have to like your shadow, it just means you stop fighting it. You stop pretending it doesn't exist. Instead, you say, this is part of who I am, and I'm okay. With that, acceptance is powerful because it takes away the shadow's power over you. When you stop resisting it, it stops controlling you. The final step is transformation. This is where you take the energy of your shadow and channel it into something positive. For example, if your shadow is anger, you can learn to use that anger to set boundaries or stand up for yourself. If your shadow is fear of failure, you can use that fear to motivate yourself to prepare and work harder. Transformation isn't about eliminating your shadow, it's about finding a way to work with it so it becomes a source of strength, not weakness. Here are some practical tips to help you integrate your shadow. First, practice mindfulness. Pay attention to your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors without judgment. This helps you become more aware of your shadow when it shows up. Second, try creative expression. Write, paint, or dance as a way to explore and release your shadow. Third, consider therapy or counseling. A trained professional can help you navigate the deeper layers of your psyche. And finally, be patient with yourself. Shadow work isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But every step you take brings you closer to wholeness. Let me leave you with an inspiring story. Imagine someone who spent years struggling with self-doubt and fear of failure. They tried everything to fix themselves, self-help books, courses, even changing careers, but nothing worked. Then they started doing shadow work. They acknowledged their fear, understood where it came from, and learned to accept it. Over time, they began to see their fear not as a weakness, but as a source of motivation. Today, they're thriving, not because they eliminated their shadow, but because they learned to embrace it. This is the power of shadow work. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. One of the most profound benefits of shadow work is inner peace. When you stop fighting parts of yourself, you stop feeling at war with yourself. Imagine no longer being weighed down by guilt, shame, or self-criticism. Imagine feeling whole just as you are. This is what happens when you integrate your shadow. The inner conflict fades, and in its place, you find a deep sense of calm and self-acceptance. You no longer feel the need to hide or pretend. You can just be. Shadow work also transforms your relationships. When you understand your shadow, you stop projecting your insecurities onto others. You no longer blame your partner for your jealousy or your friend for your anger. Instead, you take responsibility for your emotions and behaviors. This creates space for empathy, understanding, and deeper connections. You start to see people as they truly are, not as reflections of your own fears and desires. And when you stop judging others, you'll be amazed at how much more love and trust flow into your life. Another benefit of shadow work is personal growth. When you embrace your shadow, you unlock parts of yourself you didn't even know existed. Maybe it's creativity you've been suppressing, or confidence you've been hiding. Maybe it's the courage to take risks, or the strength to stand up for yourself. Shadow work doesn't just heal you, it empowers you. It helps you step into your full potential and live a life that's authentic, meaningful, and true to who you are. Finally, shadow work brings freedom. Freedom from the need to hide, to pretend, or to be perfect. Freedom from the fear of being judged or rejected. When you stop running from your shadow, you stop running from yourself. And in that moment, you realize something incredible. You were never broken. You were never unworthy. You were always enough. This is the ultimate gift of shadow work, the freedom to live fully, openly, and unapologetically as yourself. Let's take a moment to recap what we've covered. We started by exploring what the shadow self is, the hidden parts of ourselves we've been taught to reject. We talked about the dangers of ignoring your shadow, from projection and self-sabotage to emotional suppression. Then, we looked at how to identify your shadow through self-reflection, feedback, and recognizing warning signs. Finally, we discussed how to embrace and integrate your shadow through acknowledgement, understanding, acceptance, and transformation. The journey of shadow work isn't easy, but it's one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself. Here's the truth. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's not something to be feared or eliminated. It's a part of you, a part that holds the key to your growth, your authenticity, and your freedom. When you stop running from your shadow, you stop running from yourself. And in that moment, you realize something incredible. You were never broken. You were always enough. The real journey of self-improvement isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming fully yourself. So what's your next step? Start small. Take one of the exercises we discussed today, whether it's journaling, asking for feedback, or simply paying attention to your emotional triggers. The goal isn't to fix yourself overnight. It's to begin the journey of self-discovery, one step at a time. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Share this video with someone who might benefit from it, or leave a comment below about what resonated with you. Together, we can create a community of growth, acceptance, and authenticity. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to hear about your journey.